says that as we've been talking about all morning, that the U.S. military has launched this, what he calls massive ongoing operation with Iran. He says the move is in coordination with Israel, and we've seen that happen. Trump stated that the goal is to, in his words, raise their missile industry to the ground. Now, Iran has previously threatened to strike U.S. bases in the region, target Israel with its remaining missile arsenal if attacked. We've certainly seen evidence that Iran has gone after those missile bases, also some places in Israel. We've also seen that the attacks in Iran today are not strictly about the missile bases. They are very clearly aimed at the senior leadership in Iran, and the very stated threat of regime change is a shot across the bow in many, many ways. So Donald Trump made this announcement probably while you were wisely sleeping on his platform, Truth Social, this morning, just after 2 a.m. Eastern. Here's a little bit of what he had to say.
We warned them never to resume their malicious pursuit of nuclear weapons, and we sought repeatedly to make a deal. We tried. They wanted to do it. They didn't want to do it. Again, they wanted to do it. They didn't want to do it. They didn't know what was happening. They just wanted to practice evil. But Iran refused, just as it has for decades and decades. They've rejected every opportunity to renounce their nuclear ambitions, and we can't take it anymore. Instead, they attempted to rebuild their nuclear program and to continue developing long-range missiles that can now threaten our very good friends and allies in Europe, our troops stationed overseas, and could soon reach the American homeland. Just imagine how emboldened this regime would be if they ever had and actually were armed with nuclear weapons as a means to deliver their message. For these reasons, the United States military is undertaking a massive and ongoing operation to prevent this very wicked, radical dictatorship from threatening America and our core national security interests. We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated.
All right. Well, we will see. That was Donald Trump's announcement posted to a social media site this morning, several hours ago. Let's bring in the CBC's Margaret Evans, who joins us from London. Few people here know more about Iran than Margaret. Margaret, can you give us a sense of the state of Iran's readiness to engage in a conflict like this?
I think it's a bit of a mixed picture, Adrian. Most analysts would tell you that they think Iran is better prepared than it was last June, during the 12-day war between Israel and the United States and Iran, when Israel and the United States attacked mainly the nuclear facilities and plants in Iran. They obviously have been listening to, the U.S. administration talk about the buildup and been watching it in the Gulf. They will have been preparing too, and they will have learned lessons from the last go-round. So things like they're not going to be relying on, stationary missile launchers. They're going to be going for mobile missile launchers. How is that going to go? Most analysts, military analysts, would tell you their defenses are really, almost useless at this point. They were so degraded in the past. But this time around, they will also, especially given President Trump's comments yesterday, be looking at this as an existential fight, because he's talking very openly now about regime change. So are they going to throw everything they have? We see them launching missiles, their short-range missiles right now in the Gulf countries at U.S. bases there. So it is a bit of a mixed bag. I think in the long term, nobody thinks that the Iranian regime would be able to stand up in terms of, a straight airstrike war, but that's not necessarily what's going to happen. Most people are going to tell you can't inflict regime change on a country with airstrikes.
So on this point of regime change, I mean, it all depends, as you say, on the stability of the regime on the ground. And given the protests that we've seen recently, the collapsing economy, the exhaustion and fury and the rise of some civil groups, especially after like the Women Life Freedom movement. How stable is your sense that the government really is there?
Well, I'm not sure stable is the right word. It's almost irrelevant in the current circumstances, because while it is, everybody will tell you, at its weakest point, since the 1979 revolution, the regime still hasn't cracked. And even if its missile launching capabilities are degraded to a certain degree, it's still more powerful than the people it controls, than the people who would like to see it gone. It has its supporters. It has a very, very robust military, and of course the Iranian Special Guard in place. And throughout this pressure cooker period of the unprecedented protests on the streets, we didn't see any cracks in the regime. So that's what people are looking for. If you remember when the al-Assad regime fell, you started to hear stories about soldiers, kind of getting out of their uniforms and kind of putting their weapons aside and trying to flee. There's no sign of that. A very different country, a very different regime. So it can be weak, but as long as the internal structure doesn't crack, if you like, they're still going to be able to put people down. And that's when it comes down to, these calls by Donald Trump to people to go out onto the street, and throw over your government. People don't have weapons on the ground. And so it becomes a very difficult question for people. What is the risk of that? And it's we won't really know the answer to this until we see just how this conflict is going to progress in the coming hours, days, and potentially weeks.
Margaret, you're so right. Like the most potent image in any country that is under attack is not necessarily the big bombs, but that single picture of a uniform on the ground and someone melting into the crowd. I have to think that after what happened in Venezuela, when the U.S. troops took Maduro and his wife out of their bedroom, that there had to have been conversations in Iran about two things, about an escape plan and a succession plan. Do you have any sense of a succession plan?
Well, it's a good question, and it's one that's actually people were posing even before all of this, because the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is 86. So people are talking about, they were looking forward within the country, and that's one of the questions that people in Iran ask is, well, does regime change, what does Donald Trump mean when he's talking about regime change? Because is it a Venezuela scenario where you decapitate the head of state, but then you have somebody who's not necessarily a progressive? And the Iranian regime is a regime that is built to replicate itself. It will have many heads. And for sure, there is a succession plan. It will be different than the one that existed a couple of years ago. But there is a plan in place that you would have a kind of a council with the president, with the head of the Supreme National Security Council, and the Speaker of Parliament, kind of slotted in to manage the process. And then, if there wasn't conflict and chaos, there is an orderly transition regime, but there will be a place in place, something that will allow the regime to basically replicate itself with somebody else at the head. That doesn't necessarily mean that the type of regime will change. It just might mean that faces change. Will that be acceptable to the United States? Will it be acceptable to people in Iran who are desperate? They want to see the end not just of this regime or the people at the top of it, but many want to see the end of the Islamic Republic itself.
Well, indeed, I think there were some warnings to people in Iran over the last few days to get supplies for a few weeks, if you will, and some were fighting back, saying, "Hey, we can't afford to get supplies at the best of times for the next few days." It's tough to get information out of Iran right now, but do you have any sense of how people are reacting to this U.S. action?
Just one direct interaction. This morning, a friend of mine in Tehran wrote and said, "Oh, we've just heard a massive explosion." And we were having a bit of an exchange about whether this was the start of something. Was it something else? Was it going to be, a strike? And then, of course, after a couple of back and forths, the line went dead. I don't know what happened to my friend. And this is one of the things that they said before we kind of lost contact, was talking about fears that Iranian people had about the potential for a deal before this happened. And they said to me, one of the things people here are worried is that if there is a deal, what will happen is the regime will once more start speeding up executions of the protesters from the January protests, where we saw that thousands of people were killed. You get the sense that people are just so squeezed. Some people are also so exhausted with the process. They would like to see the Americans come in and say, let's see what will happen, what will be. But there are others who say it could just be worse, it could make it worse. And people, of course, are afraid for their lives because people are, bombs are being dropped on them. We're also hearing other reports, that in sort of the northwestern part of Iran, you hear about, Kurdish groups up there joining forces potentially, to be ready for some kind of, conflict on the ground if it develops into that. But I think what many people have in their minds, and this goes for people in the region and for Iran and for Western countries as well, is what happened in Iraq. How long did it take Iraq to get over the U.S. invasion in 2003? Did it bring anybody what was expected? On some levels, people would say yes. Others, they're still struggling with that. You look at countries like Libya. There are so many unknowns, and that's what people are thinking about. And in any instance like that, where there is threat to life, people are thinking about their loved ones. What are they willing to do? What does it mean when it says, when Donald Trump says, go to the streets and overthrow your government? Are they capable of doing that without, some massive defection in the Revolutionary Guard? There are so many ifs right now. The bottom line is people will be worried about their loved ones.
It has to be terrifying. Listen, hey, thanks, Margaret. That's the CBC's Margaret Evans in London, our senior international correspondent.